Good evening, everyone, and welcome to BT's Fly Tying Friday. Tonight, 16 December 2022, Mike Kelly is going to talk to us about tying midges and something about the midge life cycle. And the weekly tip this week will be about calf tails. We're going to call it Calf Tails 101. We're the Beatties from Boise, Idaho. Let me find my good friend Mike Kelly, and we'll add his spotlight. He's right side by side while we read his introduction. Mike Kelly lives in La Vista, Nebraska, and has been tying flies for 35 years. He is assistant program lead for Project Healing Waters in Omaha, where he teaches fly tying. He is also vice president of Nebraska Fish and Game Association, where he manages an outdoors related internet forum and various community outreach education programs. He learned to fly fish for trout in the Air Force while stationed in Idaho, Utah, and South Dakota. Since retirement, he mostly fishes warm water, where he found the importance of midges in local ponds and lakes when fishing for panfish and stocked rainbows. Tonight, Mike is making a presentation of entomology review with several of his patterns. And Mike, I'm gonna duck me out of here and give you the spotlight, and you can take it away.
And there we go. All right, I'm going to start by boring you with some entomology that I learned from presentations by entomologist and author Rick Heffley, biologist Brian Chan, and Rick Takahashi, the author of the book Modern Midges. We usually focus on mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies because they're bigger, and in warm months, their hatches often overshadow those of midges. But from October through April, few of those insects have heavy hatches. In these colder months and year-round in oxygen-poor waters such as spring creeks and tailwaters, midges are very important insects in fly fishing because they can make up a large portion of a trout's diet. There are thousands of species of midges ranging in size from can't see to 3/4 of an inch in some lakes. Most live in slack water such as tailwaters, oxbows, lakes, and ponds that are from a few feet deep to as much as 100 feet deep. Some of the smaller species live in streams where sizes 18 to 24 are common. The life cycle of a midge is egg, larva, pupa, and adult, the same life cycle as a caddisfly. I'm going to start with the adult female laying eggs on the water's surface, where they quickly sink to the bottom. After a few days, the eggs hatch into larvae, and most species form small tubes in the silt where they feed on algae and debris. In shallow riffles, some species live in silt tubes attached to rocks. The larvae can be red, green, tan, or black, depending on the species and the oxygen levels in the water. They can be very numerous in some water conditions, usually in lakes and ponds. 500 to 600 midge larvae can be found in a 6-inch block of silt, 6 square inch block of silt. But since they're so well hidden in the larva stage, this is the least vulnerable phase of the midge life cycle. In a few weeks, the larva matures and closes off the tube where it forms into the pupal stage. And when the pupa breaks out of the tube, it suspends near the bottom for about 5 to 7 days. Last week, Dutch Bachman talked about why he uses a glass bead for his emerger patterns because of the gas bubbles that form in the exoskeleton. Well, the same goes for midges. As the midge pupa continues to mature, the pupa forms a new exoskeleton inside the old one. And so there's a separation between the old exoskeleton and the new one, and air and gases form in between those two layers. That makes them more buoyant, but it also gives the body a really shiny, reflective appearance. And that's why most of the midge pupa fly patterns that you see have some sort of flash in the body. Although they usually head for the surface in 5 to 7 days, in late fall and winter, they could stay suspended for months until the temperature and light conditions are right for them to swim to the surface. They're not fast swimmers, and they're very vulnerable on their way up. Perdigon pattern, if you've heard of those, a zebra midge, buzzer patterns, or a Muskins style midge, which I'll show you tonight, is a good choice for the pupa stage. Once they reach the surface film, a split forms in the back of the thorax and they start to emerge from the shuck. This is the most vulnerable stage, and the CDC transitional midge is a great option to use here, and that's another one I'll show you tonight. When they're free of the pupal shuck, the adult only rests on the surface for a few seconds to a minute, and then some skate for a while over the surface, but most of them fly off right away. And then shortly after hatching, the male midges form a mating cloud where they emit hormones, and then the females fly through these clouds to fertilize their eggs. Usually within a few days, they return with fertilized eggs, and then the process starts over. Spent adult males and the females die over the surface in large numbers, and they usually cluster together. And this is when they're best fished with a cluster fly like the Griffith's gnat. Normally, when the trout are feeding on adult midges and emergers, it'll be the most obvious. Look for adults above and on the surface, or look for swallows, bats, or large dragonflies swarming over the water. But if there's no indication of surface feeding, midge pupa flies are the best selection. On streams, you can look in spider webs for adults, but in lakes and ponds, you can go to the downwind bank and look in the foam along the edge, and you should be able to see, you should be able to find midge pupa in the foam, and that'll help you determine the general size and color. Fishing a tiny midge pupa as a dropper off any high floating dry fly is a very effective technique. Use a pupa that is one size larger than any adults you can find in a similar color. So next I'll tie a couple of my favorite patterns, unless there's any questions at this point.
Mike, did you
Yes.
say what size they get in ponds and
So again, there's thousands of species, but the largest midges are found in ponds and lakes, still water like that. And that's where you can sometimes find them half an inch to 3/4 of an inch in length.
Yeah, that's what
So that would be a good size 10 or 12 dry fly hook.
that's what we found.
I've never gone bigger than a size 12, but I was amazed at the actual number of midges that can be in some waters. They stick some kind of there's a block that they drop from a boat, and it pulls up a 6x6 inch cube of silt, and then they filter that and count the number of midge larvae that are in there. And again, in a 6x6 block, 500 to 600 midges is quite a few. So you just imagine in the wintertime, I'll be soon ice fishing, and a lot of times in ice fishing, you're using very, very small. Sometimes I'll even tie some small flies as droppers along my ice fishing line. And the fish down there are just feeding very slowly, very soft bites, and it's all on small midges and other invertebrates that are down along the bottom of the lake.
Before you leave your screen share, Fred Dupre is asking that he notices midges are much larger in Canada than down here in the South. Do you know why by chance?
I don't necessarily, but it's pretty well known that with the midge hatches in the spring, they're normally larger than in the fall. And my thought is in northern climates, like say in Nebraska, for instance, in maybe late October, early November, the water conditions are too cold for them to want to hatch and start to come to the surface. So that's when they'll actually suspend off the bottom for months, sometimes before the water conditions are right for them to emerge again. To me, that would cause those pupa to get larger as they wait for the winter to end, for the water temperatures to get warm enough. But they do say that in the spring, the midge hatches are much larger than in the fall. So in the fall, it's a probably sometimes some species of midge in about 3 days, the whole life cycle happens from eggs being dropped, hatching out, turning into the pupa, the adult, and then flying off. All happens within about 3 days. So I would think in the South, with they don't have the long winters and everything, the long ice season, that there would probably be smaller midges in the South than in Canada. That's just my guess. So I'm going to start with the CDC transitional midge. This was originated by Renee Harrop. It can be tied in a size 12 down into the 20s. For size 18 and smaller, I'm going to use larger CDC feathers, but for the smaller sizes, you're going to want to use a CDC puff, if you're familiar with what those are. I don't have CDC puffs. I just have the larger CDC feathers. But also for tying this fly in a Zoom call, I don't want to try to do a much smaller fly than this. So I've got 3 CDC feathers, and I'm actually going to, instead of aligning them at the tips where you'd normally be concerned about the tips aligning, I want to make sure that the butts align, so that the stems of the CDC feather align. So this is what I'm actually going to use for a larger hook, like a size 12. So I've already started the thread on my hook, and to represent the nymphal shuck, I want to go back to that picture for just a second. If you'll notice the midge that's emerging from the shuck, you can see the shuck hanging off of there, and you can look at the transitional midge above, and you can see that tail really is a pretty good representation of that nymphal shuck, and that the body would represent the emerging adult and any wings and legs that might pop out. This is the most vulnerable stage of the insect, so this is the time when the trout are really feeding on them. So for that nymphal shuck, the best thing to use for these is grizzly neck that's not a real bright grizzly. It's kind of more of a tan, like a buff-colored grizzly. So up here at the top of the neck, these hackles are way too small for me to tie a fly on. Maybe that's a size 32 or something. But over here toward the side where they even kind of curve away, if you just take one of those really small grizzly hackles and pull it away from the skin. So I'm going to take that about the length of the hook. And tie that into the end of the hook shank. And now I'm going to tie in these, I'm going to go up to about the midpoint of the shank, about the middle of the hook. Right about there. Now again, I'm going to take these CDC feathers, line up the butts. And just like on hackle, there's a little bit of trash down here at the bottom, so I'm just going to peel back some of that. I'm going to take all the long CDC fibers, I'm just going to stroke them back like that. And then I want some of the actual CDC barbules to be past the eye of the hook there when I tie this in. So right on the top of the hook, I'm going to tie that down. I'm going to actually pull that a little bit farther forward. And that should be enough. So now I'm going to tie this back. Again, to the tail there. Right above the barb. Now I'm just going to let that CDC hang off of there. Now at this point, I'm going to take those stems and cut back like that, and then take these CDC barbules and spread them out to the sides. Those are going to be the legs and wings. And once I get those pushed out to the sides fairly evenly, I'm going to reach in here and cut off the rest of those stems. So you can see how those stick out to the sides like that. I'm going to use a brown superfine dubbing. And then I'm going to wrap that body forward. It should be a fairly skinny body. I'm going to try not to tie down too many of those CDC fibers because it's not a very full group of feathers. And then I'm going to stroke some of those back and just take the tail end of that dubbing and go forward a little bit. So again, I'll just make sure those are divided out, and then I'll take all this CDC and pull it forward. You'll see a lot of those CDC fibers are sticking out to the sides. This is an emerging insect, which is an ugly process. So that's not necessarily a bad idea. And then take a few wraps at the eye of the hook just to kind of stand that up. Now, sometimes with the CDC feathers, the way it ends up is that there's just a little tuft there sticking up, and you can leave that as part of the wing emerging. But the original fly was almost like a elk-hair caddis with a little blunt head cut like this at the front. And then those CDC fibers will help float the fly and also just dance in the water. And that thing floated in the surface film will be deadly for trout. As a midge emerger. Now again, on a size 18, you'd use a CDC puff, and you do the exact same thing. You would use one CDC puff for the, you tie it in the same way to where the barbules are a little bit past the eye of the hook, and then snip out that stem, and then just take those fibers and fold them out to the sides like this for the legs and wings. And that's a CDC transitional midge. All right, so the next fly we're going to do is the, it's a Muskins style midge pupa. And again, black is one of my favorite colors for any midge flies. I'll show you a few at the end that I've used over the years. But lately, just watching some internet schooling, I've really taken to these two flies as I think those are going to be my real go-tos. That's what I'm filling my boxes with. On this next one, you can see it's real similar to a pheasant tail nymph. And if you look at the pupa below it, you can see those breathers, the white fuzzy fibers at the front of that insect, and that's done with white antron yarn in the actual fly. But this fly has pheasant tail, which is magical. This is black though, but when you wrap it on the hook like that, you've got those little fibers sticking off. It has a silver wire, which gives it that flash that you expect from the gas bubbles inside that exoskeleton. That red is just like a hot spot. You can use chartreuse. You can use any colors you have, copper. The holographic tinsel is real good to use for that. But that's what we're going to do next. I'm going to use a black thread on this one. And I'm bravely using this stuff that I'm not very used to. Semperfli Nano Silk. And it's very slippery stuff. So I'm finding that I've used other gel spun threads, and it's kind of hard to get the thread started, but this stuff, it just seems to be really slippery. So when you start it on, you got to take several wraps to get it secured down. So I'm going to start with, normally on a pheasant tail, you would use pheasant tail for the tail. But what's a little more, pheasant tail is pretty brittle. And a lot of times after you've fished with it a little bit, it'll break. So I like to use black saddle hackle or even some hen hackle for the tail. It's a short tail, but I'm going to strip off maybe about 3/4 of an inch, some saddle hackles. And then I didn't bunch those up very well, but if you take those butt ends and just kind of tap them, this one's not going to cooperate, so I'll just pull it out. If you get those butts aligned, then the tips are going to be pretty well aligned. So I want this tail to be relatively short. So I'm probably going to set it right about there. And try to keep that on top of the hook. And I'll wrap that back to the end of the shank. Right about there. Now, this isn't real particular to have a smooth underbody, but I'm going to cut it at an angle like this, so that when I do wrap forward, it's not going to cause a bump. Now, the rib on this, I like to use a fine wire. This is Danville's Fine in silver. I have a piece here from the other day. So I'll tie that in so so the end goes to the end of the body there. And I want this to end up on the back side of the hook, so that when I start wrapping it forward, it's not going to foul the tail. So I'm going to wrap that forward. And then back to about there. And then I'm going to tie in some pheasant tail. I have a black, dyed black pheasant tail. Pheasant tail, to me, I think one of the main reasons that it's such an effective material is, even though a regular pheasant tail is brown, let me grab one here. Even though a natural pheasant tail is brown, there are iridescent colors in there. And I really think iridescent colors, if you look at any fish, even a minnow, it's got iridescent colors in it. If you look at this dyed black, it's got some green to it, kind of a bluish green sheen to it. I'm going to snip off about a 1/2 inch of those tips, because pheasant tail, again, is it's a very delicate material. And also because of that, I'm going to tie this back to the end, and then I'm going to come forward to about the 1/3 back from the eye. And then I'm going to wrap this towards me. And if you leave those curly ends on there, you can kind of help you grab it to where you don't need a hackle pliers. I'm going to wrap a nice skinny body there. You can use your finger to kind of help guide that around. And I like to go well into the thorax with this peacock curl. I'm sorry, with this pheasant tail. Give me a little bit of bulk, but that's also going to help set my wing case. So I'll tie that off. And then usually one at a time, you can break these free. Now, when I take my silver wire, I'm going to wrap that in the normal direction. So that's going to counter wrap those pheasant tail fibers. If you go in the same direction with the wire as you do with the pheasant tail, sometimes that can get buried in between the fibers a little bit. And this makes it stand out a little bit more, gives you more flash. So again, I'm going to come up into the thorax area and then tie off that wire. And then I'll just helicopter that off. If you cut it with wire cutters, the end of that wire is going to be sharp, and it's a lot of times that'll cut your thread. If you helicopter it, it's more of a blunt break of the thread. Antron has tied that on at an earlier step. So I'm going to do that now the right way. Come back to the end of there, and I'll just cut this off. And then I'll come forward to almost to the eye and just leave that hanging off the front. Tie that on. Tie in my red hot spot.
You're doing great, Mike. Just take your time. When you're done, I got to go to work. So you just take your time, Mike.
Right. Then my Christmas green peacock curl. I'm going to use 2 this time. That seemed a little. Now I'll use my bodkin to split this antron into 2 equal sides, like that. You want to leave at least about 1.5 inches hanging off of the front there so you can deal with it. Goes over here. Then I'll fold the wing case forward. Over top of those. Come on back here. And then I'm going to whip finish. So that doesn't happen again. Got my thread, got that wing case. And then I'm going to take those breathers, fold them up like this. And what I've noticed is it's best to cut them a little bit longer than what you think. So a lot of times I'll fold these up like that and cut them to what I think they should be, and then they're way too short. So that looks like about 2 eye lengths up from the eye, and that's just about right. There's a nice little breathers sticking off to the side there. And that's a Muskin style midge.
Looks good.
The Muskin style, that style doesn't have a whole lot of history that I can find anyway. But it originated in England. There's a couple of lakes, the Chew and Blagden lakes, and these flies were popular back in the 1800s and early 1900s in that region. I never thought I'd geek out on them that much, but I have noticed crappie fishing, fishing for panfish here in Nebraska. A lot of times, first thing in the morning, first light, you can see a lot of fish swirling just under the surface. And I was always just fascinated. What are they really doing there? You know, what are they going after? And then as the light started to come forward, you could see crawling all over the dock were these adult midges that were about a half an inch long. So I started tying some midge emerger patterns. I really like the let's see if I got one here.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah.
this is Jerry Chris. Hey, how do you fish that, or how do you rig that when you fish that one?
So the Muskins, I'll fish that actually as a dropper a lot of times.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes I'll fish it by itself. I like to kind of watch my line if I can. On a stream, it's a little harder to do that. Watch the transition, where your leader and your fly line, the loop-to-loop connection. Just watch that for a twitch or a movement. But that's a still water thing. That's not in streams.
So you use a regular dry leader and a dry.
I have used these off, like a big obnoxious hopper or a. I don't use Chernobyls that much, that many foam flies, but like a stimulator, just anything to use as an indicator.
Okay.
But just to get that to float in the top foot or so of the water, and you can definitely fish them deeper because they start at the bottom and they work their way up.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Mike, Rick wanted to know if you've ever tried using sparkle thread to tie these.
I heard about that in a fly a few weeks ago. I've never seen it or never used it. It's an emerger, but it's a
smoke jumper.
Smoke jumper. Yes. I like these in red and white. A lot of the flies that I used in the Black Hills, we were always stuck on what we called strawberry shortcake in a Palomino midge with the ultra chenille, and it's basically the same fly, but it has that extended body with the ultra chenille. And with that body and this is the larger ultra chenille. They have a smaller diameter. We use that in black and olive. So whether they were blue wing olives or midges, we were just killing them on that. This is a herder's midge. Another real fun fly to tie. It uses bleached elk or deer, a red body, grizzly hackle, and then a mallard flank for a tail. If anybody's familiar with the buzzer patterns, I experimented with a few of these where you tie in like a holographic wing buds on the sides, and then you basically coat the whole thing with a UV resin. Those are pretty popular flies. The perdigon flies and zebra midges and all those kind of things are meant to ride a little bit lower toward the bottom of the lake where the pupae are just kind of starting to mature.
Mike, David Crawford wants to know, what was the name of the fly with the ultra chenille?
Palomino midge. I think I have it right here. This is the ultra chenille that's a little bit larger. We recently used that for some San Juan worms for the fly tying class. But here's a olive that's a lot smaller diameter. And this is what I used most of the time in the Black Hills for in olive, black, and red in this real small ultra chenille. You can use a lot of different materials to make that extended, that whether it's looked at as a trailing shock or the body or whatever. Black, red, and olive were probably my favorite colors.
This week, we're going to talk about calftails. And as I said a little while ago, we're going to talk about Calftail 101. And there's what we've got right there. We're going to take a look at a couple of flies here in a minute, but here's a couple of calftails. This was a full calftail last week. And in the process of shooting these side-by-side videos of the Beatties at work, that disappeared and went on to hooks, and Gretchen turned them into beautiful flies after I threw a couple of pieces of hair at the hook. But we're going to talk about parts of a tail. Now, here's a tail I had. In fact, I ran out from this tail that's been all used up, and I started on another tail. And this is a good tail, and it's representative of what we run into with calftail. Fine fibers down here where it's close to where it meets the body. They're fine. They're a lot denser. There's even some underfur in here. And there, if I were to say that they're probably 3/4 of an inch long to an inch long. They vary in length, but they're much shorter, and they stay about that size for this bottom 1/3 of the tail. And then we move into the middle 1/3 of the tail. A little bit less underfur, a little bit longer fibers, but it's still about the same consistency, just not as much underfur, until we run out here onto the tip. And this is really long stuff. This is 2.5, 3 inches long.
Down a little bit.
I'm sorry. This is 2.5 inches long. Really long stuff, very little underfur, totally different texture than the stuff that we have down here. Now let's move over to the vise.
Al, prior to going to the vise,
Yeah.
would you talk about how much where the hollowness of the hair changes?
Oh, yeah. Good point. Good point. Yeah, the hollowness of the hair, along with the density that you see here, the amount of bulk.
Pull back a little bit. There you go.
Okay. There's the hair here tends to have slight amount of flare, not a lot, but it's right up in this area here where it starts to become more dense. And by the time it gets to this point, it gets quite dense. It's really tough to do much of anything with it other than to make streamer wings.
Would you say the upper 1/3 is the
No,
dense?
I'd say the upper 20%.
Upper 20%.
And the
okay.
bottom 80% is good for some part of tying dry flies. Typically, when we're cranking out some big orders, we save the bottom part for the sizes 14 through 18. Seldom do we do hair wing flies with calftail that go below 18s. And we try to keep that in the lower 1/3. The middle third goes into the 10, 12s and sometimes crosses over into the 14s. And as I say, this stuff here will end up on a few bigger dry flies or on some of our streamers, which we're going to take a look at now at the vise. But John, you're right. It's a little bit hollower here. Notice it's closer to the body of the animal. And I think that it's hollower there because it probably is close to the part of the animal where it gets a little bit of warmth from the hollowness of the hair fiber. Now, I don't know whether that's anything or not. That's just a guess on my part, but And we're going to take a look at a streamer fly that I tied with that very tail that you saw just a moment ago. It's a streamer fly that I tied today. And if you didn't know better, you'd say, well, that's bucktail. Well, in fact, it's not, but it's a good substitute for bucktail if you're tying small streamers. And in the case of this one, this is a size 4, and it just makes it, I had plenty of hair to throw some away. I could have gone as much as a size 2. Now, out of that same wing, we happen to run into a situation earlier this week. One of the things interesting about living in Idaho is there's fly fishers on that side of us, that side, over here, and back over here. We got fly fishers all over the place, including some named people like the Bantams who, run a fly fishing business. Well, I'm out shoveling snow here a couple, 3 days ago, and one of my fly fishing neighbors comes by, and he says, Al, I kind of got some good news. I said, well, what's that? He said, well, my wife and I are going with our church on an 18-month, what do they call them? Mission, yeah, an 18-month mission to New Zealand. Oh, I says, you poor person. I really feel bad for you having to go to a remote area like that. And he says, I don't know if I'm going to get to fish or not. I said, well, let me tell you a story about New Zealand fishing. So I'll turn the pause still button on this story for a moment, and we'll go back into the early 90s when Gretchen and I were first married, and we were attending one of our first fly fishing shows together. And we met this fellow from New Zealand at the show. His name was Hugh. I won't give the last name because I don't have permission to do that, but he ran a guide service in New Zealand. And he watched me at a demo table tie a royal wolf, and he made a comment like, geez, mate, I'd sure love to have one of those in about a size 2 or 4. And I said, we'll come back later. We'll see what we can come up with. And I gave him a couple of royal wolves in size 2 and 4 and my business card. And, you do that 1,000 times at a show and nothing ever happens. Well, anyway, a few weeks later, this is back in the days when we had phone calls and you talked on the phone, and when letters showed up in the mail. And a letter shows up with a postmark from New Zealand, and it was from Hugh. He says, is there any way I could get you to tie me several dozen of those size 2 and 4 royal wolves and send them to me? And so I did. And what that started in the early 90s is every year I end up sending him about 4 dozen size 4 royal wolves. He found that was the best size. He was using it on one of the lakes there and absolutely slaying the fish with them. Mm-hmm. So back to the story in shoveling the snow. I tells this story to my friend as he's walking his dog by, and I'm shoveling snow. He says, gosh, is there any way that I could talk you into tying me some of those size 4 royal wolves? I said, I'll do a couple for you. I'm not taking on any new clients right now, but I'll do a couple for you. Well, so Gretchen and I spent the day tying several, and we'll go back to the flies now so you can take a look at a different fly tied out of the same hair, but I had to use that harder hair more for streamers to tie the royal wolf because that's the size 2, or size 4 royal wolf. I did the tail and the wings, and Gretchen did the hackle. She did a beautiful job. I did a pretty sorry job, but she did a beautiful job. But anyway, what I want you to notice is I don't know if you can see it or not, but the density of the hair, you can almost see a translucence in that. Can you see that?
Yeah, you can see the translucence.
You can see the translucence, and that's as it gets out towards the tip of the tail. Now, take a look at this fly. This is one we did earlier in the week. It's from the same identical tail. And I want you to notice there's translucency, but it's on the very tips only. The hair is a totally different structured hair. Now, what am I proving to you? I have no idea, other than I can tell you it feels different. I told you that it's more hollow towards the tail, towards the base of the tail rather than the tip of the tail. And we use it for tying streamers, except when the neighbor's going to New Zealand and needs some large royal wolves. Hey, that's it for tonight, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. We're here every Friday, but for tonight, that's a wrap.